You're listening to One Decision, the podcast that looks at the key choices made today shaping our world. I'm your host, Julia McFarlane. The Russian President Vladimir Putin has not had a great year so far. While he did get to welcome Chinese leader Xi Jinping to the capital Moscow earlier this year, a rare show of solidarity, he was forced to mark one full year of his invasion of Ukraine, not counting, of course, the years of fighting in the eastern Donbas region. Putin's army has suffered immense loss, both of lives and of hardware. And in the full glare of the world's media, the tiny Ukrainian town of Bakhmut, representing the front lines of the conflict, is still, despite the full might of the Russian military, in Ukrainian control, at least for now. Perhaps now, running out of options, Putin decided it would be a good time to announce the deployment of tactical nuclear weapons to neighbouring Belarus, Russia's only real ally in this fight. Now, it will still take some time before any nukes are likely to be deployed outside of Russia, but the saber-rattling calls into question what confidence Putin may have that victory may be near. Chief international correspondent for CNN, Clarissa Ward, has spent much of the invasion so far on the ground in Ukraine, in many of the conflict's key front lines, meeting Ukrainians from all walks of life up to the highest levels of leadership. As the war begins to move to a precipice, an awaited spring offensive, she joined me and my co-host, Sir Richard Dearlove, to talk about the mood she observed in Kyiv earlier this year.
So I guess the best place to start, really, given that you have been on the ground pretty recently, there have been various incremental changes on the battlefield and developments like the announcement that we are starting to see some of that heavy weaponry, Leopards and British Challengers arrive on the ground in Ukraine, which will hopefully make a difference to their war effort. But the big question, which has been for some time now, is all about the spring offensive. And really, Zelensky has been saying that this is their best shot. The spring and summer months are going to be their best shot at trying to push Russian forces out. And it's partly why he is trying incredibly hard to persuade Western leaders to speed up their delivery of modern weapons to meet the challenge. He came to the UK, he came to European countries, his first trips outside of Ukraine since the invasion, a huge diplomatic push to try and gather a bit more momentum behind some of those deliveries. What did you sense from your time on the ground and speaking to Ukrainian leaders and leaders in the army, and what impression did you get that Ukraine is about to start that spring offensive? Were they waiting for more resources? What did you get a sense about there?
I had the impression that Ukraine is probably facing the toughest moment since the invasion. They have been losing a huge amount of men, particularly in Donbass, in Bakhmut. The Russians, of course, have been losing even more and are willing to lose even more, but the Ukrainians have been hurt by the fighting there. And I don't think it's a secret, even though you will not hear the leadership speak publicly about it, that there is some daylight between the military leadership and the political leadership inside Ukraine as to whether it makes sense to continue to expend a huge amount of manpower in a place like Bakhmut, which arguably doesn't have any really impactful strategic significance. What it has more is huge symbolic significance, which obviously then explains why the political leadership has been so keen to continue the fight for it. The expectation from some outside of Ukraine was that this much vaunted offensive really should have been underway in March. And then it became clear that it was being pushed to April. Now there's even discussion about May. As always with these things, it's a little difficult to know when they will begin in earnest. There's a lot of secrecy
Mm.
for obvious reasons, and there's often quite a bit of subterfuge as well. We've seen the Ukrainians in the past say, look over here at Kherson, while they'll then double down on an offensive in Kharkiv.
Mm.
But the broader understanding is that this offensive, when it does happen, is likely to focus on the southeast, down from Zaporizhia towards the currently occupied city of Melitopol, with the end goal, ideally, for the Ukrainians of trying to put pressure on Crimea. Because their understanding or their hope is that because that is such a sensitive point for the Russians, if they can put a lot of pressure on it, that they might then be in a stronger position to come back to the negotiating table, or really not even come back to, but to sit down at the negotiating table and try to hammer out a political solution.
Mm.
But, and this is a big but, I think there is still a huge amount of trepidation within Zelensky's government about sitting down at the negotiating table, not just because they can't take President Putin at his word, which is understandable, but also because any kind of political negotiation is going to necessitate some form of concessions. And I think that President Zelensky understands that making any concessions at this stage in the environment that Ukraine is in right now will be very, very difficult for him politically. And so you have this really challenging dynamic whereby, of course, there's a lot of interest to end the war, but there is no consensus on how to end the war. And in that kind of an environment, it is easy for the war to drag on, I worry.
I mean, there's been increasing talk, certainly in the European corridors of power, that it is likely to be inevitable that Zelensky will have to cede a loss of territory to the Russians. I don't know what the likelihood of down the line buffer zones, peacekeepers, you say rightly that they don't trust Putin at his word, but perhaps the presence of peacekeepers or a buffer zone could make it really difficult for him to relaunch another offensive down the line. But that is getting down the line, and I think the talk about carving off slices of Ukraine for Putin, European leaders might be talking about this, Richard, but is that something that they really, when you take a second to think about what that means, they can really condone? Because essentially Putin will have won. He will have been able to take territory by force, which is an international norm that even China and President Xi has said that the international community should adhere by.
I don't think at the moment you have the preconditions for negotiation. I mean, my understanding is that actually Zelensky might favor some sort of negotiation with the Russians, which wouldn't obviously concede on any points of principle. But I think that, or what I'm told is that Ukrainian people just wouldn't accept at the moment any negotiation which conceded anything to the Russians at all, because they've had to pay such a high price for where they are now. And it's not clear what the military outcome is going to be. I mean, I agree with Clarissa that one is looking at the moment at a conflict of attrition, and there's no clear way out of it. I think one of the important points, though, to make is that what's happened in Bakhmut is not a sign of Ukrainian weakness. In a way, it's a sign of Ukrainian strength. I mean, it's amazing that the Russians haven't been able to take Bakhmut, and they clearly look less likely than they did a week ago or 10 days ago that they're going to take that area. So there has been some, benefit accrued to the Ukrainians militarily. But on the other hand, if you have a war of attrition, it favors Putin. I mean, the Russians have quantity and resources. They have very little potential. The Ukrainians have potential, but the Russians, but they don't have the resources that the Russians can draw on. So the longer it goes on without any clear resolution, it's going to favor Putin. And one could end up with a situation which I think is completely unacceptable in terms of European security, where he's sitting permanently on a chunk of Ukraine. But the fact is, the outcome, really, I mean, this is where I think the West hasn't quite got it. It depends on the degree of commitment that we're prepared to make to support the Ukrainians. And we haven't, for example, the European economies are not geared up at the moment to fight a proxy war with Russia. I mean, we aren't still taking it seriously enough in understanding where this is going. I don't know, you may disagree with me, but I mean, it's going in the right direction, but it's going so gradually. We just have to step up massively our support to the Ukrainians. But I also agree with what Clarissa's saying. I mean, they're quite good at deception, the Ukrainians. When this offensive is coming, where it's coming, I wouldn't take at face value any statements they make, because the last time they did this, they misled everybody, which was a good strategy, including the Russians. And I think that they will, try to confuse the media as to what their true intentions are and on the timing of whatever offensive they're going to mount.
You say the Europeans don't have the capacity to fight a proxy war with Russia. Do
Well,
you
we
mean
have the
politically?
capacity. Well, the
Surely
capacity is there, but they aren't geared up to do it. I mean, we should
logistically, politically,
Well, both.
emotionally.
All of those things. I mean, if you went out into the street now in White City and said to the nearest person, what's your view? They would say, well, this is a distant war in a foreign country. It doesn't really concern me. Or I think the majority of people just wouldn't register. But are our armaments industries in the UK geared up to supply the Ukrainians at the rate that they need to be supplied? I don't think they are.
But could they?
Easily. I mean, if we had the resolve and the determination. But at the moment, we're almost sort of living hand to mouth. Yeah. And I mean, how many challenges are we sending? 18? That's not going to make a difference.
I think the challenge as well is that Putin understands the longer this conflict plays out, the more difficult it is for the West to keep its constituents actively engaged and enthusiastic about this conflict, particularly in Europe, where, it is hard times economically. You hear more and more. A year ago, people were saying, go Ukraine, this is outrageous, something's got to be done, we need to support them. I think you do still hear that, but you also hear a lot of people now saying, hold on a second, I can't pay my new mortgage bill. I can't afford X, Y, or Z. Why are we sending all this money? And for the first time in an interview he gave, I think just yesterday or recently with the Associated Press, President Zelensky talked about his fear about the American public essentially beginning to splinter on the issue of Ukraine and what that would portend for Ukraine on the battlefield, because politically it has started to become kind of a wedge issue, which it wasn't before. There was broad bipartisan support for President Biden's take and strategy on Ukraine. Now you see people like, obviously, President Trump, but also Ron DeSantis, who is emerging as a sort of major contender for the Republican nomination, talking about Ukraine as a kind of distant territorial dispute that shouldn't really interest Americans.
But he got quite slapped down
He
from that.
got slapped down by some serious players in the Republican establishment. But as is the case that, President Trump has made so clear to us, there is a chasm between the political establishment and between the Trumpian base, which is a very important voting bloc in terms of how engaged they are with any international issues. And so President Zelensky said, listen, if the U.S. takes its foot off the gas, even a tiny bit in terms of support in Ukraine, it's over. It's curtains. And particularly as we see China potentially now, according to U.S. intelligence services, starting to dip their toe in the water just a little bit more. And maybe now, according to U.S. intelligence, they're actively considering arming the Russians. And what a major game changer that would be on the battlefield.
So why then is isn't President Biden stepping up support, given that he has a window of opportunity now to do things that may be more difficult as the next presidential election cycle gets underway?
I think that President Biden has always, and his administration have always been searching for this elusive Goldilocks spot, right? Where you're giving just enough weapons to keep it going and keep the momentum on the Ukrainian side, but you're not giving so many weapons or the type of weapons that it's going to escalate too quickly out of your control, or that you're going to risk some nuclear conflagration. And I also think that part of that strategy has allowed them some flexibility in deciding internally what their strategic objective is. Because if you push the White House now on what the end goal is, they'll talk about the importance of a strategic defeat for Russia. But they haven't really articulated specifically, what does that look like? What does that entail? Is this an outright victory for Ukraine? Is Crimea part of an outright victory for Ukraine? Which is a crucial question. And they fall back on this no Ukraine without Ukraine, right? We're not going to, no talk about Ukraine without Ukraine. So we're not going to make any policy decisions without Ukraine being a part of those conversations, which is a nice bit of sophistry. But underlying that, of course, there are very real conversations happening about how this should end. And interestingly, that same dynamic that I described in Ukraine, with a little bit of disagreement potentially between the military and political leadership, I think also we've seen reflected in the US, with the Biden administration pushing for a very forceful approach, and the military establishment also pushing for that forceful approach. But on numerous occasions along the line, when Ukraine has had major success in an offensive, you will also hear Joint Chiefs of Staff General Mark Milley say, okay, now it's time to sit down at the negotiating table. And part of the rationale for that is, as any military man will tell you, if you don't see an obvious route to an all-out victory on either side, then you want to preserve the life of your men, and you want to try to look at what a political solution could potentially look like. Now, I happen to agree with everything that you just said in terms of how on earth could you fathom right now hammering out some kind of a political solution when it is so easy for President Putin to cool his heels for a couple of years, regroup, build up again, finish what he started. And when we don't really have a very good sense, and perhaps there are those who have a much better sense, of what Russia's ultimate goal is here, what would they be prepared to walk away from the table with? I have heard from one source that they would be happy with a buffer zone in Donbass, a demilitarized zone. But then their other strategic objective, which is far more concerning, I think, for the Ukrainians, is to completely cut off access to any maritime activity, to the sea completely, which would effectively neuter Ukraine. And so obviously that is not something that I can imagine the Ukrainians would vaguely consider or entertain. And I think that speaks to, more broadly, their resistance to engage in good faith in some kind of political dialogue without a sense of what everyone's endpoints could be, and where they might meet in the middle. And especially if you have any ambiguity surrounding the long-term support of your backers in Europe and the US, that is going to have a huge impact on how you approach that negotiation.
But how would putting a stopper on any maritime activity, how would that be enforced? By who? What were they suggesting that would?
Well, the Russians have already basically, taken the Sea of Azov as their own, and cut off Ukrainian activity. And, the Ukrainians, this is why you have this grain crisis, right? The Russians are the only ones who basically control access in and out of that port. And
But the Ukrainians still have Odessa.
But they can't get things into, so they have control of the actual port.
Yeah,
but
the sea lanes
into it are not
They've
under
got so
their
many
control.
ships in the sea that that's why they've had to negotiate this corridor for food to be able to leave Odessa.
Essentially, it would allow them to continue to have a hand around the throat of Ukraine, that they could apply pressure whenever needed. And so, again, it's hard to see how that would be acceptable to the Ukrainians. But in comparison to some of their more outlandish ambitions, and certainly their initial ambitions, they would see that, the Russians, as being a sort of fairly reasonable climb down from their initial positions. So there's a huge amount of daylight between the two sides in terms of what they're willing to discuss.
Yeah. I mean, the talk about a buffer zone, I think, sounds more likely. How come why is no one talking, if there's some reason I'm naive for not realizing, but is there some reason why we're not talking about a role that NATO can play with regard to a buffer zone?
It would never be NATO. I mean, the Russians will never. I mean, if there's a buffer zone, it would have to come from third countries.
UN peacekeepers?
Yes, but
an international presence that would mean Putin could not carry out an incursion into a buffer zone without immediately sparking a crisis that even he would not have the appetite for.
Well, I think it's difficult to imagine Russia actually accepting this at the moment. I mean, if you have a frozen conflict, you're obviously going to have some sort of controlled front line with some sort of policing by a third party. But I mean, the third party will not have the military strength to resist a Russian incursion if the Russians change their mind. I mean, you've got you've got a couple of armistice lines in the world. You've got one in Korea, between North and South Korea, which is, as it were, the last Cold War armistice line. And if you've ever been to the DMZ, the demilitarized zone, it's quite a creepy experience.
Certainly
and you
is.
see, what that operates. And the other one you've got is in Cyprus, between northern and southern Cyprus. But, you have to have preconditions on both sides that they're going to respect it, because the policing of the line is pretty ineffective. I mean, it's almost just a formality. And that's certainly the case if you go to the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. I mean, you've got tiny... I can't remember which countries now police that. The Poles are there. I can't remember who else are.
But that kind of model, whether it's something that is administered by the UN, that isn't something you think the Russians would agree to?
Well, I think we're just not far enough into the military conflict to know what the answer to that is. And I think, Putin is still of the view, I think, that he can win this. I mean, winning is a subjective description, but come out in a position where he's sitting on enough Ukrainian territory, that we'll lose our will to support and fight. And of course, if you don't back the Ukrainians, they're not going to come out of this in front. So we just haven't reached the point yet. And there are so many sort of speculative options. I mean, Clarissa's described them brilliantly. And, which one becomes reality will, I think, depend militarily on what happens in the rest of this year, probably.
Clarissa, you mentioned Joe Biden's concern at nuclear escalation. I wonder, what did you make of the announcement recently that Putin intended to now deploy tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus? There's obviously the building of a nuclear storage facility in Belarus in order for them to have that capability. And the Russians claim it should be ready by the 1st of July. A lot of experts have cast a bit of doubt on that sort of time frame. And I came across this situation in Kaliningrad, where there's apparently been a nuclear storage facility that they have been trying to upgrade and renovate since 2016. And even yet, it's still unclear whether that facility has any nuclear weapons contained into it. I mean, what do you make of... He's obviously raised the prospect of him using it. He's now going a bit further by saying he's moving some of these to Belarus, whether it's accurate or not, that he can have that in place by summer. What did you make of that announcement?
I tend to view this as a lever that President Putin tries to pull on whenever he feels he needs to re-inject fear onto the battlefield, because the Russians understand the power of fear. I think they're concerned that they have lost that at certain points through, frankly, the ineptitude of their own military. And so he wants to try to continue to dangle that threat. But when you talk to anyone of the sort of various analysts and people who study this, who have gamed out a number of different scenarios and who view Putin as still being a rational actor within the context of his own universe, no one seems to feel that there is any strongly compelling reason for Putin to introduce the use of, let's say, a tactical nuke onto the battlefield. Because while you may certainly reintroduce fear, the fallout from it is going to be such that ultimately it will probably hurt Russia more than anything else it will achieve. It will certainly spook the Chinese, who appear to be mulling over, as I said, taking a more proactive approach in this conflict. It will very much upset the entire international community. It will render that piece of territory that they take by virtue of launching a tactical nuke a no-go zone. So it's not even necessarily helpful in terms of expanding territory. And obviously it will kill a lot of people, although depending on how it's used and where it's used, the numbers can vary a huge amount. So I tend to view it as a threat that he uses, that he understands is still powerful and is still important, and that no one can afford to underestimate, even if it seems very unlikely. Because what is clear when you look at the sort of war games that have been played out on this issue is that if someone does cross the Rubicon and use some kind of a nuke, whether it's a tactical nuke or otherwise, very quickly it escalates to a point of arguably of no return. So I think there's a broader understanding that you have to take this seriously and you can't be cavalier about the threat. But my assumption, and it may be somewhat naive, is that at this stage, it is still about saber rattling. It's about the use of threat. It's about applying pressure. It's about making it clear that he's upset about something without it necessarily portending imminent use of nuclear weapons.
I mean, it is a crossing of the Rubicon. I wonder then, given the extensive use of chemical weapons in Syria in recent years, why, obviously do not want to tempt fate, but why have we not seen that, given that the use of chemical weapons would not lead to the kind of escalation that tactical nukes would, yet he is willing to reference those increasingly regularly?
I would just say on that there are a lot of tactics that the Russians used in Syria that we have not seen them replicate in Ukraine. And I don't want to imply for a moment that the Russians are being merciful or somehow more respectful in Ukraine. However, from their perspective, they are. From their perspective, they are taking care to try to avoid hitting churches, for example, or heritage sites, or they have killed a lot of civilians. They have shown a flagrant disregard for the lives of ordinary people. But I was on the ground in Aleppo in 2015 and 2016. And this was, you're talking apartment buildings every single day being bombed, hospitals bombed. But I mean, literally on a daily or weekly basis. The casualties were astronomical in Syria. And partly that's because they had air superiority, which they have not been able to achieve staggeringly in Ukraine. I mean, not surprisingly at this stage, but at the early stages of the conflict, I think it was quite surprising to people. But partly it's also that they are trying, at least for an internal audience, to show that the Ukrainians are still our brothers. Don't forget, that's how this is being marketed inside Russia. The Ukrainians are our brothers. Historically, we're one people, but they're being governed by right now by, Banderites and Nazis and fascists, and this is an extension of the Second World War mission, and it's our job to save them. And that's the sort of rhetoric. It's not we need to kill as many Ukrainians as possible to destroy the terrorists, which was the rhetoric that you were hearing in Syria. I can't say whether that accounts for why you haven't seen the use of chemical weapons. I think there was a moment where there was a lot of speculation that chemical weapons would be used in some kind of a false flag operation, potentially.
Yeah.
I also think the big difference is every journalist in the world is on the ground in Ukraine. The Ukrainians are unbelievably savvy about messaging and PR and getting videos out and releasing wiretaps of conversations that are happening. And so if the Russians did cross that line, I think it would very quickly escalate even beyond what we saw in Syria, where the Russians were still able to bombard the space with misinformation and create this persistent thread of doubt of, will we ever know what happened? How can it ever be proven? You wouldn't be able to get away with that in Ukraine.
But I mean, the use of chemical weapons in close conflict, like you've got in Bakhmut, is not straightforward either. And I think it's unlikely that they would, as it were, go to the complexity of using them, because you have a threat to your own troops unless
They're on the ground in Ukraine in a way they weren't in Syria.
Yeah, it's different, and it's a different sort of conflict. And actually, the chemical weapons used in Syria, if I'm right, were Syrian on their own people. They weren't Russian. I mean, the Russians used heavy ordnance and a lot of bombing and artillery and all the rest of it. And of course, they control the airspace. But I think one of the extraordinary things in Ukraine is clearly the vulnerability of aircraft to ground defense systems, and the fact that there hasn't really been use on either side significantly yet of an advantage of fighting from the skies, as it were. And I mean, there's a lot of speculation about the Russian Air Force, whether it's actually willing to enter combat or whether they just use the planes as standoff platforms to launch cruise missiles, which is what they've largely done. So the cruise missiles are launched way away from Ukrainian airspace, which the Ukrainians control. So I think a lot of people are quite puzzled by the way that the military conflict has evolved. It's not at all what some of the experts expected.
Which is why it has that interesting dichotomy of, on the one hand, it's like World War I.
Yeah.
You see in the trenches and, close quarters, long-range artillery, in a way that we haven't really seen recently in recent wars. And on the other hand, it's the most technologically sophisticated war that has ever been fought. And that's partly down to the Ukrainians they have an incredible spirit of innovation. They have a strong background in tech. All the Silicon Valley CEOs at the beginning of the war started calling Mikhailo Fedorov, the Minister for Digital Transformation, who's this sort of wunderkind 32-year-old impresario who has really kind of transformed the way this conflict looks, and also because the Americans really trust the Ukrainians, and so they're willing to let them test out a lot of their various software in a way that they didn't feel comfortable doing necessarily with their Afghan colleagues, for example. And so it is this interesting and strange tension between, on the one hand, feeling like you're looking back in history, and on the other hand, feeling like you're looking into the future of warfare.
Also very low-tech, high innovative warfare going on with these, drones that you can buy from Amazon, but then essentially just sticking TNT on them, are having quite a lot to do in Ukraine as well.
Well, I think drone warfare has been one of the big revelations of this conflict. It's extraordinary, and no one anticipated that drones would play such a crucial role. But I mean, it gives you an insight into what future battlefields will look like. And you're right. I mean, drones are cheap. They're expendable. You don't want to shoot them down with a missile that's going to cost many millions to fire. I mean, it's a really interesting. I mean, if you're interested, it's an extraordinary laboratory that's being worked out in front of us.
But I think we should all be interested in it because it's terrifying. Because
yeah,
it's making
sure.
these kinds of weapons of war way more accessible.
They're way more accessible, but the way that it would be presented, because I talked to Fedorov about this back when I interviewed him in late January, and he actually believes that drone warfare is the future.
Yeah.
And even within the context of this conflict, in the coming months, you will start to actually see a dramatic transformation in the way it's fought, not just from the sky. He thinks also at sea. He thinks he's literally talking about robots fighting on the ground as well. And from his perspective, the huge game changer here obviously is, I mean, there are many elements to it, but the main one would be to try to mitigate some of the casualties that you're seeing on the front lines, because at the moment, both sides are hemorrhaging young men. Russia at a much faster rate than the Ukrainians, but the Ukrainians have a smaller population. They're definitely feeling it. When I was just there, they are desperately trying to draft more people. They talked to several people, even working in our bureau, younger men, about them potentially having to go and take part in their military duty. So both sides are feeling the pressure. And drones potentially are a way of shifting the way wars are fought, and ideally of saving the lives of your manpower so it can be better deployed elsewhere.
Richard, Clarissa was speaking earlier about how President Putin has really tried to control the narrative and the optics of the war in Ukraine. You said recently, you said it quite a lot last year, that you do believe that this is an existential battle for Putin, and it's obviously not going very well. It's costing him a huge amount of lives. He may be swelling his war chest through the trade relationship with China and making a lot of money through hydrocarbon exports and everything, but he has not yet, or has he, started to pay a political price for the fact that his 3-day military operation has celebrated its first year anniversary? What do you think is happening behind the scenes? I mean, what have your contacts and colleagues told you about what is happening in Russia and the mood, and when are the screws going to be tightened on him?
I think this is largely guesswork. I'm not going to claim any inside view. I just cannot believe that there isn't tension inside the Kremlin. I mean, having met and dealt with, a long time ago, some of the people who are still there and very key figures.
Patrushev?
Well, Patrushev in particular, who was head of the FSB way back and was certainly an occasional interlocutor. I mean, these are not stupid people. They must know that they're in a tight corner militarily, and that politically they must be struggling to control public opinion. And I think in Russia you probably have to look at sort of two levels of public opinion. There is a sort of sophisticated elite who probably understand very well just how badly things are going. And then, there's a much greater mass of the Russian population who are exposed to very sophisticated media control and therefore really don't understand. But that is sort of elite Russian group, whether it's people around oligarchs, many of the less sort of Putin supporting oligarchs have left or their families are out of Russia. I mean, there's no question there's a problem, but whether it's a big enough problem yet to trigger political and social consequences in Russia, I think we just don't know. I would speculate that if there is a successful Ukrainian offensive and it really begins to go very badly for the Russians militarily, then maybe you have the preconditions for some sort of political upheaval and political change in Russia. I mean, you've mentioned World War I, but I mean, there's a famous parallel as to what happened in 1917, when the Russian military collapsed completely, and Lenin, had to make peace with the Germans and surrender, vast amounts of what was Russian-controlled territory at the Brest-Litovsk, I think it was. And I mean, there's no question that there are some interesting historical parallels. And I think that the Russian General Staff now will themselves be massively concerned about escalation because the military is no longer in a condition to face any sort of conflict with NATO. And I mean, the Russian option would be to escalate immediately to a sort of strategic nuclear conflict, but a conventional war on European soil, I mean, if it did escalate across the border, I reckon the Russians are doing everything in their power to make sure that that doesn't happen, because they would be in a powerless situation.
We have this situation where Russia's military strategy is being masterminded not by military veterans, but by the band of spooks at the top. And I find it interesting that the Russian military is not empowered in Russia in the way that, say, if we look at Israel, I don't want to talk about Israel, but if you look at Israel and how you have big sections of the Israeli army are saying, we're not going to fight for what we see as increasingly turning into a dictatorship over Netanyahu's plans for judicial overhaul. You have the reservists, who are very highly regarded in the Israeli army, saying they're abandoning their posts. You have head of army generals and all these senior military people having at least the distance from the executive to still have that power and the empowerment to take that opinion, to take that position. But in Russia, you get all the army generals and military leaders who are carrying out their orders, and none of them have a military background.
Yeah, but I think what one's underestimated in this conflict, well, maybe not now, is the human element. We talk about the weapons systems, and, we talk about the capability and capacity of two armies. But ultimately, the commitment of the forces fighting on the ground, their motivation, their leadership, the ability to mount, sophisticated combined... I mean, what's extraordinary about the Russian military is they have not been able to mount sophisticated combined operations. So they can do kinetic bombardment, and they can do expensive in lives, frontline conflict. But to mount, highly mobile, what you would anticipate in modern warfare, which the Ukrainians probably now are training to do. So you'll see a different style of fighting when they mount the spring offensive. But we're in a very, very strange situation, and the human conflict, I think, now is turning out to be the human element of conflict is turning out to be absolutely essential. And obviously, the Ukrainian military is so much more motivated than the Russian.
Clarissa, you were shaking your head when I was asking that question, and you disagree with the comparison of Israel, or
no, I just would say that first of all, the Russian military, Israel's a democracy. Which means that people feel empowered to take a stance, not usually the military, but the Russian military does not have that kind of precedent for, getting in front of an issue or taking a stance on it or really inserting themselves into the realm of politics at all. They basically do what they're told. I think in this case, it's clear that they have been largely neutered, in the sense that we've seen it was Gerasimov, and then it was someone else, and then it was Gerasimov again. And it's like there was resistance to Russia pulling out of Kherson, allegedly coming from Putin himself, even though the military understood implicitly for a long time that that was not a sustainable position for them to keep in the city, and that they were much better off pulling out and then just hammering Kherson with artillery as they've continued to do. So I think if you're a general, but you don't really have any leeway or latitude to fight a war in the way that you'd want to, and also if realistically speaking, you're presiding over a military that has largely been hollowed out by incompetence and corruption, which people assume of the political leadership, but don't realize has extended to the military leadership as well. And so they were all there initially gaming it out and telling President Putin what they thought he wanted to hear. And we're going to go in here, we're going to go in there, we're going to do this. They weren't anticipating that he was going to turn around and say, let's do it. And when he did, in a sense, they got caught with their pants down. They've been playing catch up ever since. The one thing that guaranteed them success in Crimea during the annexation was that they had basically gone in, the sort of the FSB elements, and paid off everyone who was anyone and said, this is the deal. Here's your however many million. And when we come in, you raise your white flag and say, oh, thank you so much. We're so excited you're here. They did the same thing.
Yeah, they did the same thing and it didn't work.
And everyone turned around at the last minute, was like, you know what? Yeah, I'm going to keep the money, but no. Except for the leadership in Kherson. They went with the plan. Everybody else,
yeah. That's absolutely right.
did an about face. And so for Russia, like, that's how you get things done in Russia. You bribe people. So when you take that out of the equation and your gobs of money are no longer enough for you to impose your political will, then you are really in a tricky situation. And combined with that, what you're saying about the lack of morale, you're a young Russian, you're being sent into the meat grinder. You know you have a very good chance of dying. You're not going to be properly equipped. You're not going to be properly trained. You're going to be possibly shot if you try to turn around and go back away from the front line. So what's the real incentive there? Of course, you're going to have some diehards who really buy into the propaganda, but a lot of others are going to kind of grudgingly go along with it, which is not the same thing as fighting your heart out for your country and something you believe in and something that you're really willing to die for. And the one other thing I just wanted to circle back on about Bakhmut, which I think, Sir Richard raised, which is really important, is the idea of, what a strategic defeat in Bakhmut would mean for the Russians, because we've been talking about the military. It was also huge strategic defeat potentially for Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of Wagner, the private military contractors who have, really inserted themselves into this battle. They've attracted a lot of headlines, recruiting in prisons, recruiting murderers and rapists and sending them to the front lines. And if that has failed and he has lost a huge amount of manpower, which he cannot easily backfill because the Russians are no longer allowing him to recruit in prisons, that is also a very powerful victory on a symbolic level for the Ukrainians.
Yeah, I mean, there are reports now that since he can no longer recruit out of prisons across Russia, he's now going to martial arts centers and dojos across Russia for his recruitment. I mean, Russia doesn't have that many dojos to replace.
Judo became quite popular after President Putin sort of, excelled in it. And
yeah, I mean,
But I mean, Prigozhin has clearly, to an extent, fallen out with the military leadership.
Yeah.
I mean, there's clear signs of tension there. So I think his star perhaps is waning. And I should think Putin is probably thinking about distancing himself from...
It's an interesting one because he's gambled a lot on this conflict and he has seen that there's a gap in the market from hardliners who for the first time ever have been critical, not directly of Putin, but of all the leadership around him and of all the military efforts in Ukraine. And he has become a very vocal critic himself, which for a man who I've been doing stories on for years and you couldn't even get a statement because officially Concord Catering wouldn't even respond to you. What is this Wagner that you talk about? This doesn't exist. And who is now such a vocal presence, and and such a thorn in the side of the Russian military. I think that he has made more enemies than he has friends, and possibly this is sort of he's on a knife's edge now. I would counter, although I can't. It's anyone's guess as to what his political future would be. I think he thought for a minute there that maybe he actually could turn his personal fortune into a political future, which is really the only way in Russia of guaranteeing your personal fortune.
Because I would have thought that would have been the most dangerous thing about him for him. The fact that, not that he has criticized the Russian military, but that he hasn't really tried to disguise the fact that he has political aspirations of his own, which is a very dangerous thing in Russia to have.
He might well find that he's one of those people that's fallen out of a high window in a Moscow building,
I
of which
expect
there have
so.
been rather a number recently. Accidents like that.
I wanted to ask you, Clarissa, because he made this really weird video statement recently where he seemed to unveil, in quote marks, what he believed the Ukrainians' plans would be. And he had this sort of this video interview which he released on his social media channels, saying that Ukraine was gathering large troop reserves ahead of its planned spring offensive, that Kyiv's troops were going to try and surround his forces in Bakhmut and try and cut through various supply lines and things like that. You have said that the Ukrainians have, in the past, planted sort of, impressions for the Western media that turned out not to be true in order to disguise what was a very successful recapturing of Kherson, for example. Do you think this is Prigozhin trying to do the same thing, trying to say, we know what the Ukrainians are trying to do, but actually it's false information? Or what was the point of that bizarre video?
I haven't actually seen the video, so I would just couch what I'm about to say with that caveat. But, it could be that he's paving the ground. I do think he's under such a tremendous amount of pressure in Bakhmut, and he really, really needed a victory in Bakhmut. If he was looking at a victory in Bakhmut, he would be emerging as a very strong player. But you can't talk that amount of smack and then lose and not pay a serious price for it. So it may be that he's trying to pave the ground for a more dignified defeat somehow by implying that the Ukrainians have something massive up their sleeve that will be impossible for him to counter at this stage. I mean, we've certainly seen him talk very publicly in the past about the lack of ammunition. There's one extraordinary video where he's literally walking through a sea of Russian bodies and just saying, this is the result of ammunition starvation. And the obvious goal there is to A, try to get more ammunition, but B, try to deflect blame for the failures on the ground onto people in Moscow and otherwise in the corridors of power. So that may well be the reason behind it. He is an extremely savvy actor in terms of his messaging. For someone who has operated in the shadows for such a long time, it's been kind of extraordinary to see him step out and in the space of a year become one of the most central figures in this war. And I think for journalists, one of those villains who is hard not to love on a certain level, and I'm putting, inverted commas around love, but because he is so over the top.
He's like a pastiche baddie.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so he gets an enormous amount of coverage. That will obviously change if Bakhmut spells the end of Wagner's activities in Ukraine and he's forced to sort of waddle back to the Central African Republic with his tail between his legs, I think that dynamic will shift.
Richard, you mentioned a little earlier, you were talking about sort of historical comparisons with, the degradation of the Russian army. I wanted to, because I do want to move towards China and Xi. But before I do, I wanted to ask what you thought of the fact that Russia now appears to be pulling out loads of Soviet-era T-62, T-72 tanks from the basement and sending them to Ukraine. And it's getting a lot of coverage because at this moment, there is arriving into Ukraine modern battle tanks from the West. We know that the Russians have sustained huge losses from their military inventory, but is this a sign that things are now getting into the red for Putin, that he's having to heave these sort of creaky old pieces of junk, basically?
Yeah, I think one's got to be a little bit careful in interpreting. The Ukrainians are very good at disinformation too. I mean, clearly, I read something recently which was one of these sustained analysis of Russian losses of vehicles on the battlefield. And there was someone arguing that actually the losses are much greater than we realize, and that their ability to manufacture and replace is not geared up yet. So they're having to pull this old kit out of store, recondition it, and put it on the battlefield. But I don't know if you read, there was a commentary recently by a tank commander written in one of the UK papers, I think it was in the Telegraph actually, saying, if these machines have to stand up on the battlefield against modern Leopards or Challengers, it's just ridiculous.
Yeah, they can basically drive right over them, apparently.
Well, not only just, and even if they were hit by a shell from these tanks, wouldn't even know they'd probably been hit because the armor now is so sophisticated. Whereas, the response would be, terrifying and lethal for this kit. I to be honest, I don't really understand if the Russians are putting these things out, what they're up to, because it would look like an act of desperation in terms of having some sort of, armored support for infantry. But it's really, you could interpret it as a pretty desperate throw of the dice, and something clearly. But I mean, Clarissa's already mentioned the problem of corruption and the hollowing out. And I think it's quite clear that a lot of the kit that's been in store, even the modern kit that's been in store, it doesn't work properly. The tyres aren't in the right condition because they weren't replaced. The kit's not been properly looked after and, oiled, and all the maintenance that has to be done. I mean, storing military kit is a huge task. And I've lived in Switzerland. Switzerland's had a huge territorial army. I mean, it trains large numbers. It keeps.
It does?
The Swiss have a national call-out, or they have that capability to put together a very large army for a small country. So they have to keep in underground stores in the mountains massive amounts of stuff. And of course, being Swiss, it's all in beautiful working.
The most stylish tanks you'll ever see.
They have to employ an awful lot of people, an awful lot of time to keep all this stuff there, and it's part of Swiss national security. And I mean, that's a comparison between the absurd and the ridiculous, because I mean the Swiss answer is so extreme and they're so precise and they're so thorough, whereas you have an absolutely opposite culture in Russia.
Yeah, interesting. Clarissa, I want to ask you about the China element, because another thing that happened recently was, of course, the state visit to Moscow of President Xi, and lots to talk to you about that. But firstly, I thought it was quite interesting that Zelensky recently appeared to suggest that perhaps Putin's announcement of deploying tactical nukes to Belarus may have been because that summit with Xi did not actually go down as well as he had hoped. It was a bit of a nothing burger. In fact, the last time they met face to face, just before the invasion in 2022, they had that announcement of a friendship beyond with no limits, and there wasn't really quite the same the same theatrics, the same sort of rhetoric that passed after this. It seemed quite perfunctory. You mentioned that China is mulling sending more lethal aid to the Russians. But how did you think that state visit went? Do you think Putin got what he wanted out of that visit?
I think the very fact that it happened, that President Xi went to Moscow, that was what Putin needed, right? He is feeling very isolated right now. He had just been indicted for war crimes by the ICC. 2/3 of the countries in the world have signed up to the Rome Statute with the ICC, which means that technically they would be obliged to hand him over if he set foot on their territory. We can have a separate discussion about how much teeth the ICC actually has. But nonetheless, I think symbolically it speaks to the isolation in this moment of the Russian Federation. So to have the Chinese leader visit and extend a hand and show support, I think is hugely valuable for President Putin. I think what was clear when you looked at the dynamic there is that President Xi almost sees Putin as sort of Russia is the junior partner in this alliance. That's obviously slightly wounding to Russia's pride on a number of levels. On the other hand, they're not in a position right now where they can be turning down any handouts that they might be given. And I think more broadly speaking, for the U.S., the possibility of China playing a more active role in this conflict is frankly pretty terrifying, would dramatically change the dynamic on the ground, but also geopolitically across the globe. And so it's a very powerful card for Putin to have in his back pocket. Now, I say it, have in his back pocket. He doesn't have it in his back pocket. It comes with a lot of preconditions. The Chinese are not willing to just gamely go along with whatever Russia wants to do. And we've seen instances before. There was a summit in Samarkand in Uzbekistan where it was very clear that the Chinese and the Indians, but more concerningly, I think the Chinese for the Russians, were actually quite critical of Russia's inability to wrap this thing up, basically, which is how I think it had been originally presented to them as something that would be quick and swift and efficient, and about the dangers of having this turned into a protracted conflict with all that that would entail for the global economy as well. But if U.S. intelligence is correct, and if China is seriously considering supporting Russia with lethal aid, that would be a major shift in this conflict, and it would be a major advantage, needless to say, to the Russian side. So I think regardless of whether President Putin got exactly the talking point that he wanted to out of it, or whether he was forced to acknowledge that, some things haven't been going perfectly, the fact that she went, the fact that, they talked about this peace plan that the Chinese have, that President Putin appears to buy into, at least on paper, even if nobody else does. I think that that's all very powerful for him in terms of optics. And he understands as well that while the world has really stepped up and united behind Ukraine on this, and particularly in the West, the global South is a completely different story. And the Ukrainians I spoke to in Kyiv over the last couple of months understand as well that this is a real Achilles heel for them. This is where they have not been as successful in selling their narrative, if you like, partly because they don't have the money diplomatically to be deploying diplomats all over the world and having them wine and dine and have extensive conversations and offer lucrative and attractive trade deals, etc., but partly because for the global South, a lot of the issues that are at play here are not as directly relevant to their populations. So that is going to be another challenge for the Ukrainians going forward. And I think it's, again, a card that President Putin is keen to play to the best of his ability.
Richard, I'm really interested in what Clarissa said about Russia sort of smarting at being the junior partner to President Xi's China. And I think that is a really, really interesting dynamic. I mean, it is going to be smarting to be seen as anywhere near a vassal state of China. I mean, there is a lot of it has to be said. There's a lot of racism in Russia against Asian people. It's one of the reasons why the Siberians are really sidelined in Russian society. I'm told that one of the reasons that Shoigu, among other reasons, could never be a serious contender for leadership is because of his ethnicity, for one. But I mean, Russia and China compete in a lot of strategic areas, and they are uncomfortable partners. Are they not? I mean, there are still places on their border where they have where they have sort of rockets pointing at each other, sort of historically, that they haven't really bothered to change position. There are a lot of states in Central Asia which are in Russia's orbit that Russia does not want to see sort of oscillating towards China. I mean, what Putin is doing, the price that he's paying for President Xi's support of his war is going to have effects that will last long beyond his leadership in Russia. And it is going to mean something for Russia and the future of Russia if it is going to effectively bow down to the Chinese in a lot of these strategic areas where they do actually compete. Does he think it is a price worth paying if he cannot essentially defeat the West, which is how he frames this war in Ukraine? What he can do maybe is then support the Chinese in their long-term strategic goal of essentially and eventually replacing the US as world hegemon.
Well, obviously, this relationship is crucial to one's interpretation of, let's say, future international politics. And I mean, stated simply, Russia is in post-imperial decline, I would say. So it's going through that anxiety of having been, a powerful world player, and it's on its way down, unquestionably. Of course, China is going in the opposite direction, and the future of global security is going to be some sort of deal between the United States and China, not between the United States and Russia. I mean, Russia is going to be a bit player. And it may not accept that yet, but I think that's more or less inevitable. And historically, the relationship between China and Russia has actually been problematic since the 18th century. And, bear in mind that there are large swathes of Russia which were part of China. And I'm sure that China's ambitions to dominate the world by 2049 or whatever the statement is in the papers that came out of the 20th Party Congress would probably in Chinese minds include the recovery of bits of territory which are hitherto Russian.
Vladivostok.
Well, yes, and I mean, I can't describe precisely the geographical lines, but you can look at a map and imagine which bits they might recover. Look, Chinese policy towards Russia at the moment, I think, is packed with ambiguity. And Xi and the leadership of the Communist Party will be looking at this situation saying, what is in it for China? How can we exploit this to our advantage? Now that, as Clarissa's described, plays to an extent into Putin's hands. And obviously, if you're ambitiously contesting US dominance in the world, it's natural, given the politics of those two countries, that there should be some sort of relationship and alliance. But I think Xi at the moment is treading carefully. And, simultaneously with him, as it were, being nice to Putin, we do see signs that he's behaving a little less aggressive internationally than he has been up to the 20th Party Congress. And for example, you've just had this equivalent, meeting of Western businessmen in Beijing, to which a lot of American high-tech the fact is that I think if you take a longer term view, the entwinement of the Chinese and the Western economies is much more important strategically to China than the relationship with Putin. But you can see why at the moment that relationship is being handled differently. I mean, the Chinese have great subtlety in the way that they exercise their foreign policy options. And we've been through a rather extraordinary period where they've been very, surprisingly aggressive. And I think at the moment you can see a little bit more caution in the way that they're conducting themselves. And this is a very complex issue.
Can I just ask one question, because I'm so curious what your read is? Because again, the U.S. did this, something that would have been considered extraordinary a few years ago. They released some of this intelligence saying that they believed the Chinese were preparing potentially to give lethal aid to the Russians. We saw them do that, obviously, at the beginning of the war, telegraphing in real-time intelligence. What's your take as an intelligence man? What's your take on this strategy? It's obviously a real departure from how the US or the UK or any of the Five Eyes would normally go about things, but it seems to have been effective, would you say?
Yeah, I think that's I'm sure someone's going to write a book about this pretty soon because it is unprecedented. Well, not completely unprecedented, but it's very, very unusual that intelligence has been deployed in this conflict so publicly. I mean, deployed in relation to Ukraine pre-invasion, deployed in relation to, discouraging China from being a two-front foot in their support for Putin. I think we live in a world where if you can use intelligence without prejudicing sensitive sources, and that's obviously a key calculation, it can be put in the public domain. I mean, the problem is how you collect it and whether you can use it. I mean, intelligence that you collect and don't use, however sensitive it is useless. I mean, intelligence is not collected to be stuck in a cupboard, in a top secret file. It's there to support a policy and a series of decisions. And I think the US government, the UK government recently have become much more adventurous. But you would then have to speculate why they've been able to use it.
But intelligence has a political currency nowadays, and governments are facing greater demands for transparency and for accountability. And so the intelligence is there also to justify policy actions.
Well,
now.
To an extent. I mean, policy usually depends on an amalgam of considerations or an amalgam of knowledge in which the intelligence, might be one chapter out of 14. But it might be the crucial chapter. It often depends on the nature of the issue.
But it's also a power play also, isn't it? To say, look, we can see what they're up to. It's a very public...
Yeah, to an extent. But I mean, the other thing is that intelligence has a date stamp on it very often. And, if you don't use it, it expires. And okay, it's a body of knowledge may be quite useful. But, and a lot of collection now, of course, is technical. So if you're clever in the way that you collect, you can probably use it more easily than you can human intelligence, which is prejudicial to the source because the source has to have access. So there's a sort of theorization behind this, which is quite academic in a sense. And it's why, intelligence studies in universities now has become such a big deal. I mean, it didn't exist when I was sort of growing up in my career originally.
Well, your whole department didn't exist back in the day.
Well, it was. Let's say it was buried deeper than it is today.
We're almost out of time, but I have one final question for you, Clarissa. Richard said that China's interests are playing into Putin's hands in the war. But I wanted to ask you a bit more on that, because essentially you could sort of guess that perhaps Xi's interests in the Ukraine war may be for the West and the Ukrainians not to win, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's in his interest for Putin to win either. I mean, it would work out quite well for him, would it not, if the war would actually continue and for the West to stay preoccupied and expending a lot of resources into supporting Ukrainians, taking their eye off the ball on things like Taiwan and such like.
I think it's a tough one to answer because it's difficult to know exactly what President Xi's most pressing factor is in terms of dictating what the policy is. I think that historically, for China, transgressing international borders has always been anathema, right? And they've been very quick to chastise the US predominantly over Libya, but before that over Iraq. China's whole thing was that countries should mind their own business. And that was certainly China's way of at least officially engaging. And then using other economic platforms as ways to sort of extend their reach. That has obviously shifted dramatically with President Xi adopting this new term and feeling much empowered and emboldened and much stronger rhetoric that we're hearing, and the talk of Taiwan, and it's a totally different perspective on global relations. So it could well be that China's priority for now is to protect its own national interests, and that it does serve a certain purpose to watch the conflict grind on, to watch the West expend huge amounts of money and political capital, potentially trying to keep the war effort going. But the point about the intertwined economies is an important one, because ultimately I think China is a country that looks at its bottom line economically. And the war in Ukraine is not really doing anyone any favors anywhere on that front. So yes, they might be able to get cheap oil at the moment, but in terms of trade and, the sort of broader economy, they, like everybody else, are paying a price, and it's a price that's only going to get more painful if this conflict grinds on interminably. So I think that when you look at it from that perspective, I think there would be a reluctance, therefore, to see this economy, to see this conflict turn into what it already has really effectively turned into, which is a war of attrition that could last many, many years. And I think it's important at this point just to remember that while we have been very focused on the last year of this war has been going on since 2014.
I think that's a really important point.
And okay, it was largely a frozen conflict. In a sense, there was not a lot of movement on the front lines, but still, it was grinding on in the background for many years. And so I don't know what the answer is or where things go next, but I do think obviously there's strong concern about ensuring that we don't just see a momentary cessation of hostilities, which then translates into another decade of the occasional back and forth on the front lines, but no real meaningful political settlement.
Do you think it's really getting to the stage where it's Xi who will call the shots, given how much Putin has had to cede a lot of his political capital? If he is the junior partner, is it really going to be up to Xi to lean on Putin to say, you need to take this settlement?
I haven't got a clear answer to that. Maybe. I mean, Xi obviously is going to be a consequential player in how this plays out over time, because it's the one partner country with Russia that has a predominant influence. There's no one else quite in that position. So Xi must have a role, but at the moment, the Chinese peace plan is not realistic, and it's designed not to be realistic. I think it's just the Chinese, as it were, playing diplomatic games to sort of demonstrate to, let's say, the global South that they have a solution, but it isn't a real solution because it doesn't offer practical options to either side really at the moment.
Although it was interesting, I thought, and this is perhaps a slight tangent, that they were able to pull off this Iran-Saudi Arabia
that's interesting.
rapprochement, which, again, 10 years ago, inconceivable that the Chinese would be brokering that kind of a deal in the Middle East.
Is that more about China or more about how pissed off the Gulf nations are with President Biden?
Well, it's sort of Mohammed bin Salman's style to, as it were, upset the United States. But on the other hand, I still think that Saudi-US relationship is pretty fundamental to Saudi interests. And okay, the Chinese see an opportunity come in from the side. Salman gets to tweak Biden's tail because they, don't like the idea that the peace, the agreement with Iran has been sort of potentially reopened.
And I think that also comes back to this idea as well that, like, for the Chinese, this is not ideological, is the point, right? For the Americans and for the Europeans, this is really ideological. This is about a way of life. This is about the future of liberal democracies and their ability to stand as a bulwark against authoritarianism. So there is a huge amount at stake for the West here if this doesn't go right. And for China, it's more about picking your moments, seeing how this can serve your national interests. You asked if, she would have the last word. And I don't think it's the Chinese style to stand in front of other world leaders and wag their fingers and read them the riot act and tell them what to do. I think they're much quieter and much more subtle in their approach, which doesn't mean to say that they're less effective. It's just that they're more discreet, let's say. But ultimately, this isn't a existential question for the Chinese in the way that it has become for the West and certainly, I would argue, not necessarily for Russia, but for President Putin.
I agree with that.
That's it for this week's episode of One Decision. We drop new episodes every Thursday. Like and subscribe so you never miss an episode. Drop us a line. Tell us your thoughts. What decisions have impacted you and where you live? You can write to us. Our email is onedecision@onedecisionpodcast.com. From me and the team, thank you for listening and see you next time.